The Chicago Bears' first preseason game gave us some highlight reel plays, some answers on this Bears depth chart and 53-man roster, and most importantly, no major injuries.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. The Chicago Bears preseason game has to start with Justin Fields. We'll look at his performance, the progress and development that we've seen from him so far, and the areas that maybe he needs to keep working on here throughout the preseason and into the regular season. We'll turn our attention to then Matt Eberflus' defense, some of the good that we saw there, some of the works in progress there, and obviously injuries, a big factor on both sides of the ball. So we'll wrap up kind of looking at what we learned about this depth chart and 53-man roster, about where guys are playing ahead of who and what type of special teams opportunities are playing into this as well. That's starting to answer some questions, or at least make some things a little bit more clear on some real early favorites to guys to make the 53-man roster, or at least stay ahead here on the depth chart. It has to start with Justin Fields, because everything is all about Justin Fields this season, and hopefully for many, many seasons. And for Fields, obviously, we should make sure there's the big asterisks on all of it, not just for the quarterback, but for the team as a whole, that yes, this is the preseason. It's not a real game. They did not specifically put together a big game plan for the Chiefs as an opponent. I don't think they're putting in a lot of scouting work and scout team stuff at practice. It's not replicable to a real game situation. And the players the Bears were missing are significant. Not their full offensive line, certainly not their full wide receivers, missing their top 3 tight ends. So this was not, and top running back, of course, this was not going to be the Bears offense or defense that we'll see in the regular season. And on top of that, it was, I think, 18 plays for Justin Fields on offense. So it's a small sample size. It's not the full players, and it's a preseason game that's not a regular setup. So all of that is to say, let's not overreact to the good or the bad from this game. But with Fields, we certainly saw a couple of highlight reel throws, impressive downfield passes, one to Darnell Mooney on the left side of the field on a little wheel route out of the slot, man coverage, nice pick route to get him open and put a nice back shoulder ball for him to go up and pull down. And then similar type of throw on the right side of the field to Tajae Sharpe, another back shoulder throw, one-on-one coverage, and a great catch by Tajae Sharpe, but also an impressive throw from Justin Fields. That throw is tight man-to-man coverage. Tajae Sharpe is at no point would I consider him open on that route, but you're throwing it back shoulder to kind of throw him open. And yes, it was a really spectacular catch, but Justin Fields is throwing that from the opposite hash. I was somewhere 15, 18 yards downfield, however deep it was, but he's also throwing it really far horizontally because you're on that opposite side of the hash. It's about 30 yards from that hash to the sideline where he threw it just horizontally, plus 20 yards vertically, and would be the hypotenuse of that triangle. I'll let the math majors out there calculate that distance for themselves, but it's a more difficult pass when you're throwing farther from across the field that way, and to put it just in that spot where the defensive back covered the play really well and got a hand up going for the ball, but it was only where Tajae Sharpe could go get it, albeit with a spectacular catch. It was really impressive all around for Fields on those types of throws in particular. You add in some of the dropped passes there, and I think statistically, it ends up being a solid passing performance on limited opportunity for Justin Fields. The offense didn't score. They punted a few times, didn't really, it wasn't moving fluidly as a whole unit yet, but for a lot of those reasons we described as the big asterisks on a lot of things about this preseason game. But I think for Fields, where we saw the most development and progress was in his processing and going through progressions. That when he was in the pocket looking through his reads, he's getting through them quickly. He's going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 and sometimes back to 1 depending on the play. Some plays are one read throws, right? But there were plays when he seemed to be able to get through quickly and ultimately winded up on his check down a little bit. But that's still good progress for Fields to be seeming to get it quickly and have it work through his brain at a slightly faster rate than it was last season. That was one of the criticisms of him as part of this idea of maybe holding on to the ball a little bit too long. But I think it wasn't all fixed for Fields either. There's still room for improvement here. And the area that I didn't see as much progress as maybe I would have hoped or what you'd like to see more progress on moving forward is specifically the pocket presence. He sometimes doesn't quite make the right, perfect, natural decision in the pocket, but it's not always the same mistake, right? He's not doing the same thing over and over again. It tends to be in different areas. Like on some plays, he's leaving the pocket too quickly and should have just hung in there and waited. Like there was one or two where there was just no pressure. The offensive lineman had not gotten beat, and he's standing in there and just feels like he needs to move and do something because he's been standing there even though the protection had held up on that play. Overall, the pass protection wasn't as good as it needed to be, and there were other plays when like an offensive lineman's getting beat and he needs to like step up and around the pressure or take off. And there were a couple times he got hit or took a sack that he didn't necessarily need to. And certainly when Fields takes off out of the pocket, it can still be a good play for the Chicago Bears. It's not as though he's hurting the team when he leaves the pocket too quickly on some of those plays. But it's just in terms of his development as a passer, you want the running to be kind of a emergency last case thing to take a play that's falling apart and turn it into something that's not a disaster. And in this case, like he had more opportunity to still see the play through a little bit, try and find a receiver, and then you can still decide to run if you wait another second or a second and a half in the pocket, and then things start to break down. It's just the little things as far as kind of cleaning up that presence and feeling truly skilled and natural at maneuvering the pocket and stepping up into it. Part of that's going to be getting used to a new offensive line that isn't even its full complement of offensive linemen, and getting used to new receivers and when they're going to be open, when they're not going to be open, how quickly they move in and out of their routes in certain routes at certain positions on certain plays. So there's a lot of different moving parts for Fields to have to adjust to, and we wouldn't have expected him to come into the preseason and fixed every single flaw he had last season and look like this perfect quarterback by any means. But it's some progress in some key areas and some other spots to keep working on moving forward. Same kind of thing for this Chicago Bears defense. Our first time seeing Matt Eberflus's crew. We'll kind of look at the good, the bad, and the in-between from that side of the ball, and then get to some of the things we learned about this roster next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at BetterHelp. I'm not ashamed to say, and there shouldn't be any shame, we shouldn't have a stigma about seeking mental health treatment and going to therapy. And I meet with a therapist every single week virtually, and you can do the same thing with BetterHelp. It really is an important part of my own personal well-being. You take care of your body and you need to take care of your mind, and BetterHelp is here to help you be better. It's right there in the name. It's not a crisis line. It's not self-help. It's professional therapy done securely online, available to people worldwide. You can log into your account at any time and send a message right to your therapist. You can schedule weekly video or phone sessions if you don't want to be on camera, and you can get therapy every week with just a few clicks on your laptop or on your phone. Sometimes it can take a few tries to find the right therapist for you, but BetterHelp makes it really easy to change therapists if needed. It's totally free to jump around until you find the right one for you. Plus, it's more affordable than traditional offline therapy. BetterHelp, it's a great way to invest in yourself. They have a special offer for Locked On Bears listeners. You can get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/lockedon. There were moments for this Bears defense in the preseason game that impressed me in some ways. There were certain positions that I thought I had some concerns about that played pretty well and maybe better than I thought it was. And there was other areas that I was a little bit surprised when a player or a group in there wasn't exactly what I thought they would be or were built to be. And the same asterisks as we talked about with the offense. You're missing Roquan Smith. There's some injuries in the secondary, certainly. And it's around a similar sample size. I think some of the main guys only played like 15 defensive snaps. Eddie Jackson gets done from there. Jalen Johnson comes out from there. Justin Jones gets done from there. They let some of the younger players play a little bit longer. The true like starter. Like Jaquan Brisker played, I think, even into the second quarter, if I remember right. And some of the defensive linemen, even like Travis Gibson and Al-Qadim Muhammad, played a little longer than I thought they would. But it took them. Apparently, they wanted to get some extra reps, and those linebackers stayed in there as well. But obviously, I think the stars were pretty clearly Jack Sanborn from the undrafted rookie free agent from Wisconsin, who, if you're a longtime listener or an off-season listener, if you've been listening to this podcast, I told you about Jack Sanborn as soon as the Bears drafted him. I've mentioned him a couple of times on the podcast as an undrafted free agent to keep an eye on, a guy at that linebacker core that could step up and be a guy that beats out some of the other veterans, as long as he can sort of make some plays and show out on special teams. And lo and behold, he's kind of the star, kind of the overall star of the game for the Chicago Bears. Had a big interception, some tackles for a loss, really got in there and looked like he belonged. But most importantly for Jack Sanborn, also, he led every single Bears player in the game in special teams snaps. He was a 4-phase special teams guy in this game. And, I don't get on here much and say I told you so. And obviously it was one preseason game. He might not even make the 53-man roster at this point. But it's more just you heard it here first kind of thing. That's what you get here with the Locked On Bears podcast. Also, everyone liked a lot of what we saw from Jaquan Brisker. Really, all the hype from training camp practices seems to have translated really well to the preseason game. Delivered a couple hits. He did miss a tackle early on there, but it's his first time out there trying to tackle NFL players. I understand he was not the only one either, but really a lot to be encouraged about from him. And when you look at how the defense used him and Eddie Jackson, I looked at the snaps. I think Jaquan Brisker played 5 snaps at free safety and then 17 in the box. It was very much the strong safety role. And Eddie Jackson played 13 snaps at free safety and then 3 that were either in the box or in the slot. So they really wouldn't make it the Eddie Jackson deep, Jaquan Brisker in the box thing. But most of the time pre-snap, they would start out with 2 deep, and then it would be Brisker that would rotate down and Jackson could rotate over. But it looks like it's getting Jackson more into the Eddie Jackson role. It's preseason. It's not we can't read into scheme too much, but it really started to have more defined safety roles between those 2 players that should really help both of them do pretty well. One of the players I was a little bit not disappointed in all around, but there was part of his game that surprised me in good and bad ways, and that was Nick Morrow, the linebacker. Obviously, I think Nick Morrow will play differently and perhaps better when Roquan Smith is next to him. Maybe at this point, do we have to say if Roquan Smith is next to him? I guess we can't assume for sure that Roquan Smith will be back, even though we had been assuming that for a while, but that's such a wild card right now. But with Nick Morrow, I was impressed. I was surprisingly impressed by how aggressive and physical he was in run defense. I sort of associated him similarly to Roquan as being a great athlete who can certainly run and chase down a ball carrier. But Nick Morrow was lowering his pads, meeting the offensive lineman in the hole, a pulling guard he lowered his shoulder into, and made a couple of nice fits in run defense. He wasn't always the guy making the big tackle or the tackle for a loss, but he filled his gap against a much bigger player that should have otherwise bulldozed him out of the way. And I would have expected to bulldoze him because he's lighter and faster and not a big physical take on blocks type of linebacker. But sort of inverse of that, I was a little bit disappointed from him in coverage. Again, one game, not panicking, not thinking, not a referendum on Nick Morrow, one preseason game. But there were a couple plays where, especially in zone coverage, it's not, he's not reading it and feeling it as quickly as you would want him to be. And we can't expect him to be necessarily like Roquan Smith there, but the first big completion to Travis Kelce was a crossing route where Matt Adams, the linebacker, was on him in man coverage, and Nick Morrow was in a zone. It was cover 1. So Eddie Jackson, zone deep safety, Nick Morrow underneath zone linebacker in the middle of the field, everyone else man coverage. So Matthew Adams has Travis Kelce. You might want to keep an eye on Travis Kelce in any matchup against your linebackers. And Nick Morrow is supposed to be in the middle of the field and pick up anything that goes in the middle of the field. And he just lets Kelce go right behind him. It wasn't as though he was 10 yards behind him. He was close enough that you would hear and maybe feel the air movement of Travis Kelce running behind you, and he just sort of like steps and feels Kelce go by and doesn't turn or react or anything to help on that route, the only route in his area. And I would have thought that an athletic linebacker like Nick Morrow would be more instinctual in coverage like that. And there were other times too in zone where he's just a step slow to read or react or understand the play that's being run at him. And a lot of times he can make up with that for his speed, but it's like he needed to help Matt Adams there because Matt Adams didn't stand a chance one-on-one against Travis Kelce. So some good and some bad from Morrow. That was a little bit surprising. Maybe that changes if Roquan Smith is next to him and it's a little bit of a different ask. But regardless, part of the process there. And also disappointed in Khyiris Tonga as a nose tackle. Maybe given that he's a 7th-round pick, my expectations might have been a little bit too high. But like he gets the starting nod there with Angelo Blackson out. And I don't know, it just felt like too often the offensive linemen were able to move him off the spot. And he's supposed to be like 325, 330 pounds. And like a double team moved him 4 yards off field. I don't need him to split the double team and make a huge play in the backfield, but just don't move, right? If there's 2 offensive linemen, just anchor down and don't let them move you off that spot. But instead they were getting a lot of displacement on him, which created more holes for the running backs. And I was just expecting bigger and stronger from perhaps the biggest guy on the Chicago Bears roster. I think it's more technique, not a lack of strength, but like his pad level was too high. His hands weren't getting inside, and they would just end up getting under him and moving him a little bit, and he couldn't keep his feet under him that way. So, a little disappointed from Tonga, a little bit surprised at times from Nick Morrow, but really liked Jaquan Brisker and Jack Sanborn, of course. And I thought the pass rush at times showed you some things. Other times, Patrick Mahomes had a little more time than you like, but pass rush, work in progress. But without Robert Quinn, you might have expected it to be even worse than it could have been. So, overall, you're seeing the defense starting to come together a little bit, but it's still not anywhere close to full strength, so I can't evaluate the unit as a whole. Much like the offense, I'm not going to panic about them not being able to score. I'm more looking at Justin Fields' specific traits and the areas that he's trying to develop and understanding that the development will continue here throughout the rest of the preseason. We'll start to get a better sense, too, of what this roster is going to look like. I know the deadline, I think, is tomorrow to cut down from 90 to 85 players, I think the number is. So we'll hear a little bit more of that. But we'll kind of go through what we learned on the depth chart here, some key positions with some guys clearly getting more playing time and seeing more earlier opportunities that this coaching staff maybe then favoring them over some of the other players at their same position next on Locked On Bears. Tell you what, after watching, or I guess while I was watching that Bears preseason game, the way Jaquan Brisker was playing out there mid-game, I went on to our friends at BetOnline, and I placed a bet on Jaquan Brisker for Defensive Rookie of the Year. BetOnline is going to be the fastest and easiest way to check on all your betting needs. It was right there for me, right in the middle of the game. And it was Brisker plus $6,600. And I'll be transparent with you. I think I bet $22 on Brisker. That would pay $1,500. It's a long shot bet as a Defensive Rookie of the Year, but man, you see him play out there and you can just envision when he gets some turnovers, some big hits, the hype could build as a long shot Defensive Rookie of the Year. And our friends at betonline.net are going to be the number one place to get your sports bets in, not only for the Bears this season, but you can find reviews and news of every league: Major League Baseball, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, golf, live in-game betting, you name it. BetOnline is the top online resource for all of your sports wagering information. Head on over to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. BetOnline, where the game starts. The bigger takeaway for me from preseason games is all about figuring out who's going to make the 53-man roster, where the depth chart stands, and how the coaching staff feels about these players. And they'll never tell you how they feel about the players, and the unofficial depth chart they put out doesn't always mean a ton. But what does not lie is the tape, and more specifically in these kind of games, the snap counts and when players are out on the field and when they're not. The guys playing at the end of the fourth quarter, probably not as likely to make the team, but the guys rotating in with the starters, the guys getting the earlier reps, the guys getting the long looks, those are the ones that are really pushing hard for this team. I already mentioned, Jack Sanborn leading the team in special team snaps, 3 kick returns, 5 kickoff coverages, 5 punt returns, 8 punt coverage teams, and 1 time on the field goal team. Like, he was a 4-phase special teams player. They wanted him out there every time to see what he can do on special teams. Had a special teams tackle, I think it was either the first kickoff or punt that the Bears did. I think it was the first punt that the Bears, I think it was the first kickoff the Bears had kicked. Anyway, regardless, he had a tackle in there too. I remember his name getting called. And there's one clearly, I think he is moving up in this linebacker depth chart. And I think based on how they were used, we can kind of tell that, okay, your three starters in this game without Roquan Smith were Nick Morrow, Matt Adams, and Joe Thomas. When Matt Adams left the game, Joe Thomas actually was the middle linebacker, the backup middle linebacker, even though he started at the strong side linebacker. But like those three plus Roquan Smith, clearly your top four linebackers. Smith, Morrow, Thomas, Matt Adams. Number 5, the way Jack Sanborn played in that game, plus he got all the special team snaps, could seem like Jack Sanborn's right in there as number 5 linebacker. And then if they're going to keep 6, the next guy right in there, neck and neck with Sanborn, is Caleb Johnson, an undrafted free agent last offseason. Also was one of the first guys off the bench. I think he was the first linebacker off the bench before even Jack Sanborn. I think when Morrow went out, Joe Thomas came in for Morrow, but he had already been in the lineup. So Caleb Johnson took Joe Thomas's original spot at the linebacking core. So Caleb Johnson might be 5, but Jack Sanborn is now pushing him, and 5 and 6. They might keep 6 linebackers, 3 starters, 3 backups. That's kind of how the depth chart could go. They could maybe try and get away with keeping 5 if guys like Joe Thomas have some positional versatility and the Bears just don't use all 3 linebackers on the field all that much in the regular season. But like that seems to be cleared up, that like the other guys, Noah Dawkins, Javen White, DeMarquise Gates, clearly much, much farther behind there at linebacker. And I think Sanborn is playing his way right into a backup linebacker spot, and then Caleb Johnson potentially also in the mix there. Caleb Johnson, by the way, the second most special teams snaps in the game. Both guys were in on the opening kickoff, the opening punt. They were clearly like first team starting special teams players in this game, in addition to getting a lot of opportunities there at the linebacker spot. A name to watch at defensive back that played more than I thought he would have, and especially stood out on special teams, a guy by the name of Devontae Harris. The Bears just signed him like a couple weeks ago. The time in the preseason has kind of gotten away from me a little bit, but it was just within after training camp has already started, they brought in Devontae Harris, and he was, again, on the field he was the gunner on the first punt, and I think he was also the vice on the first punt return, and he also came in fairly early off the bench at one of the outside cornerback spots. He's very quickly pulled ahead of a lot of the other young cornerbacks on this depth chart. There were also 5 injured cornerbacks in this game, so that's not to say that Harris is all of a sudden has the fast track to a roster spot, because you got, you'll have Kyler Gordon coming back, Tavon Young, Thomas Graham, a number, Duke Shelley, Kindle Vilder. None of them played in the game, so it's not like Harris is just gifted a spot, but clearly a guy they wanted to take a longer look at and seemed to like a lot of what he did, ahead of some of the other guys lower on the depth chart. The Greg Stroman, the Bo Pete Keys, Jason Stanley, even Jalen Jones, the undrafted rookie free agent. Harris, a guy to look at that defensive back position. And then on the defensive line, when Justin Jones was the first defensive lineman subbed out, and the first defensive lineman off the bench to rotate in was LaCale London, an undrafted free agent from 2 years ago, who's been with the Bears in the preseason for 2 years now, or this is his 3rd preseason in Chicago. Practice squad guy a lot, but he was the first 3-technique backup coming in off the bench. Not to say he's now guaranteed a roster spot, but seems to be ahead of the pack there, ahead of Mike Pennell. Pennell was still on the bench when LaCale London went in there, and some of the other guys that they have at that interior defensive line. There's still some injuries there, so no guarantees, but we're getting some clearer answers on who some of the top options are there. Offensively, seemed to be a very clear delineation at wide receiver. The entire first-team offense used 3 wide receivers. For every play that Justin Fields was on, there was no more than, it was some combination of these 3 guys, and no one else rotated in with Fields. It was Mooney, it was Equanimeous St. Brown, and it was Tajay Sharp. You never saw Daz Newsome out there with Fields. You never got to see Dante Pettis or David Moore or Chris Finke or any of the other wide receivers. For me, it's pretty clear at this point that your top wide receivers, as they are right now, we kind of know the big 5. When healthy, it's Mooney, Pringle, Velus Jones, Equanimeous St. Brown, Tajay Sharp. There's your 5 wide receivers right now. Do they keep 6? Maybe. At that point, it's kind of wide open, but they're really far. It seems to be those guys really ahead of the pack from everyone else. And it did not help that Daz Newsome muffed the first punt. He was the first option they go to for the punt return. Show us what you can do. See if you can make the roster with some of that special teams. Drops it. Then picks it up and runs backwards for 11 yards. Just not about as disastrous. I mean, other than losing the muff, I guess, but about as disastrous as you could get from Daz Newsome there. The one caveat at wide receiver with Tajay Sharp in particular, great catch, big-bodied receiver, a lot to like, never plays special teams. Throughout his career, he has never been a special teams contributor. And so on the Bears depth chart, if you're the number 5 wide receiver, will they keep a guy at 5 that's not going to play on the special teams? Or does he become number 4 or number 3, and then you have Equanimeous St. Brown and Bayless Jones playing more special teams? I mean, some of your wide receivers are going to have to contribute on special teams. It doesn't have to be Tajay Sharp, but somebody's going to have to. So I don't know where the depth chart numbers are going to play out, but clearly Sharp and Equanimeous St. Brown being the only 2 guys they go to with the other guys injured with that first team puts them ahead of the pack on everyone else, and not a great showing there then for Daz Newsome. The other one that stood out to me is that third-string running back, Treston Ebner, the rookie, versus Darrington Evans, the free agent from Tennessee. We also saw Ebner rip off the longest run of the game, big one there that looked nice, had a couple of nice kickoff returns, and so you might think right away like, oh, Ebner's got the fast track to the 53, so long Darrington Evans. But much like the bottom of the wide receiver depth chart, your number 3 running back primarily going to need to be a special teams player. And kind of quietly, Darrington Evans was the guy they went to a lot more on special teams. They still gave Evans some real snaps on offense. Ebner was clearly ahead of him on offense because they wanted to see more of what Ebner can do with the ball in his hands. He's a rookie. They want to see more of those opportunities. But it was Darrington Evans that was out there as a blocker on the opening kickoff. He was a blocker on the punt returns. He was a gunner even on one of the punt coverage teams. You don't see a lot of running backs line up as a gunner on the punt coverage team, but he was out there and trying to get down there and tackle the kick returner. There's more, as of right now from this first game, there seemed to be a little bit more special teams value from Evans over Ebner. And you might say, well, maybe Ebner can be so good on kickoff returns that that's his job, but I kind of feel like maybe Khalil Herbert is still the kick return guy. They just didn't need to give Khalil Herbert any reps because they know what he can do as a kick returner. Does he need to go back there and get those in the preseason? Probably not. Plus, they knew he needed to be the starting running back because David Montgomery was hurt. So they just said no kickoff return for Khalil Herbert. Let's let Ebner do it. I think Ebner took every kickoff return and made a couple of nice returns. But like, if your plan going into the season is Herbert is your kickoff returner, then Ebner's not going to get those opportunities. And if he's not getting those opportunities, then I don't know how much, his special teams acumen is going to apply there. They did have him on a couple of, like later in the game, kickoff coverage units, and I think he did a couple of punts as well, like as a non-return man for something. But clearly Darrington Evans was a guy they seemed to trust more and put in bigger those roles on special teams first, that I'm not so sold just yet that Ebner's going to make the 53-man roster. I still think there's a decent chance at a practice squad there, and I wouldn't be necessarily overly worried about another team poaching him just yet, but nothing is decided there after the first preseason game. That's for certain. We also saw the Tevin Jenkins, Larry Borum battle at right tackle, but that's still sort of ongoing there from training camp practices, and I don't know that we learned anything particularly new. Jenkins had a penalty, but it was because he was just blocking a guy. He blocked the guy so hard that he was moved past the line of scrimmage. He was chasing him to kick his butt. So I don't necessarily blame him. He's got to be smarter than that, but he wasn't doing something dumb or intentionally. He was just trying to block extra hard, and you kind of want to encourage that. But I thought Borum played particularly well. Pass protection was very clean. Both of them had some ups and downs in the running game, but overall, no real answers there. Plus, Riley Reiff will be coming back at that offensive tackle position too. So a lot to still dig through the rest of the preseason and training camp. And you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. If you're looking for your second listen, check out Locked On Fantasy Football here in the Locked On Podcast Network. You can hear the intellectual fantasy expert Vinny Iyer bring his 20 years of NFL expertise and experience to find unique angles to get you the moves that no one else has in your fantasy league. So get ready for your fantasy draft or your upcoming season with Locked On Fantasy Football. Come back tomorrow for all the latest updates from Bears training camp. And also, don't forget to come back for your next opportunity to bear down.